Okay, welcome everyone. I'm so glad you could join us tonight for our fourth in a series of panels on Domestic Violence Awareness Month. We have with us tonight the wonderful and esteemed three heads of practice for our clinic. They include Rebecca Weininger. Rebecca, wave your hand. Leah Kim, who is our Director of Immigration Practice. Rebecca is our Director of Domestic Violence, and Noreen Kim, who's our Director of Housing. So tonight we're going to talk about how domestic violence is, how we see domestic violence in the clinic and how it really can impact all of our areas and what we see from our vantage point and what we see as far as the laws go and as far as, what our clients struggle with. So, one thing I think we've all noticed with our domestic violence clients is that often they come into us with a series of problems. It's not just a domestic violence problem. They often have a housing issue, and they may also have an immigration issue. So to that end, I would like to open this conversation up by asking each of our three directors to start with an example of a case that you worked on that covered more than one of our practice areas. Rebecca, I will start you off.
Thanks, Susan. I'm really excited to be here and to talk about this because by the time somebody gets to the clinic, as you said, a lot has gone wrong and a lot has impacted that person's journey, and we're only one stop on that journey. We never know when someone walks in the clinic where they are on their housing journey, on their immigration journey, on their domestic violence journey. And one of the things that the three of us and the four of us with Susan care about much is meeting as many needs as we can. We know that anytime a client leaves the clinic or leaves any point of entry, having to make more phone calls, it's unlikely. Each obstacle aggregates until it's even more likely that they're going to get their needs met. And so we can identify that someone has more than one need legally and we can meet it. It's pretty phenomenal. So one way that the three of us work together auspiciously right now, we have a series of clients who are in the country on spousal visas and they could lose status if they either get divorced or their husbands lose their job or their husbands go back to their countries of origin. And once an abuser gets his victim this far away from home, that they're on a visa, they are in a country where they don't speak the language as a first language. They don't speak English as a first language. They might not have any resources. They might not have access to the money that he's making. They might not even know how to go and buy groceries. And then on top of that, they are in danger at home. And right now we have a series of those cases where we are working together to navigate that very thin line between keeping them safe but making sure that we don't put them in jeopardy in terms of their immigration status, and empowering them with as much information as we can for them to make their own decisions, while simultaneously some of them are living in a shelter or being evicted, conceivably evicted, obviously not during the moratorium, but they're far behind on their rent, perhaps because their husbands aren't paying. We have a series of those clients right now. We, the three of us, work in tandem and to meet their needs, and we see that kind of crossover all the time. Leah, do you want to talk about those cases?
Sure. Thank you, Rebecca. So like Rebecca said, the pandemic has made DV and immigration work so closely together because there has been just a huge uptick. I want to say like 30 to 40% of our cases in immigration right now have a DV aspect to it. And it does add on, and immigration not having lawful status or being so dependent on their maybe U.S. citizen spouse or their the primary visa holder spouse adds another layer to the DV issue, because being here without a social security number, being here without any kinds of avenues to work, just puts them even more vulnerable, and it makes the abuser use those things as another way to keep their spouse here. So Rebecca, like she said, we've been working really closely on several immigration cases where the spouse is here on a dependent visa and the principal visa holder is the abuser, and they use that And it's been years of abuse in their home country, and they bring them here. And then you're right, they don't have a work authorization, so they cannot legally work. They don't know the language. They're dependent on their spouse. Their spouse uses financial abuse and the immigration abuse to keep them under their control. And also because of the language barrier and cultural issues, they don't call the police. They think, things that happen between a husband and wife stay at home. And so there's a huge fear of calling the police. And so during this time, what we do is we do as much as we can to educate and to safety plan, because either they're ready to leave or they've already left. But how do we keep them safe? And we have to remind them numerous times that their immigration status is tied to their spouse. And so and they ask over and over again, well, what about my immigration status? And we have to ask our clients a lot of times, okay, what is the priority, your safety and freedom, or is it your immigration status? Because we sometimes have to pick one or the other. And for us, their safety is the number one. So, and whenever they're ready to pursue any kind of immigration status, that's when we do everything that we can to see if there's any way we can help them get some kind of lawful status in the United States. And luckily, under the laws, there are some avenues for our clients to get legal status separate from their spouse. And so we do that to do whatever we can. And then, of course, that comes with the whole housing issue. And sometimes the lease under their spouse's name, or there's an order of protection, the spouse can't come in and they don't pay the rent. So that's when we bring in Noreen to see what she can do. Noreen?
Yeah, and there's obviously, a huge intersection from all of the practice groups and the work that we do, and between domestic violence and housing. Domestic violence is such a huge issue because of it could create such housing instability. Domestic violence is the leading cause of homelessness for women and children. And it's obviously incredibly important for survivors of domestic violence to find safe and also affordable housing. And those are a lot of what we do, I think, is try to give people understanding of what their options are, where they're in a domestic violence situation, knowing what they can or cannot do to break a lease, to find alternative housing, what their rights are under the law. So we've had a number of cases with Rebecca's group about tenants who are victims of domestic violence, who need to assert their rights under what's called the Illinois Safe Homes Act. And that basically allows a victim of domestic violence who's a tenant, who's facing a threat of domestic violence, of imminent domestic violence in their rental unit. It gives them a right to break their lease and allows them to move out, or to change their locks if they decide that they still want to stay there. So we've had a number of cases like where clients have called about just a housing situation, perhaps, not even realizing that this law exists, and it is something that they can assert to deal. And of course, landlords aren't going to bring this up and let them know about it. So it's really important to explain to them what their options are about that. But I think also it's, for some of the clients who come in with what they think are housing issues only, it's many times that they don't even realize that there is something else going on that we can help them with. And I'm thinking about one client in particular, Rebecca, who we both helped, who, she was calling about a housing situation, a problem with a landlord, trying to break her lease, learning to assert her rights under the Safe Homes Act, which she didn't know about. Also, she was a voucher holder, and it was trying to assert her rights with the housing authority to give her moving papers to move to a new unit where she wouldn't have to be at risk. But she didn't even realize that she was a victim of domestic violence, had fled to this state from abuse from an ex-boyfriend, and she didn't even realize that his recent texts and sort of threats that he was going to see her soon and knew where she lived now was enough for her to get an order of protection. And so I hooked her up with Rebecca. She had a long conversation and learned what her options were as a domestic violence victim.
I just want to say that obviously the three of us know a lot about our practice areas, and I am honored to work alongside them, Noreen and Leah, not just because of that scholarship, but because one thing that happens when the three of us work together is that the women, and I'm using women as a shorthand, right? I mean, we do also represent men, but just as a shorthand, a lot of these women are using their voices for the first time to defend themselves in any number of ways. And having three women who are willing to fight for them helps so much more than legally. There are so many barriers to the independence that we fight for every day. Women of color, in particular, immigrants, women of color, have so many obstacles in this country to independence. When they see that we will fight for them, that we will believe them, and that there are three women who will stand up for them, at some point, the legal win takes a back seat to what we have helped them accomplish in terms of their own self-confidence. And when I get a call from Noreen or from Leah saying, I have someone, will you talk to them? That is an opportunity that I see to reinforce the positivity, the belief that we have in them, and to be a warm and bright light on this journey. And so the byproduct of the intersection of all of this is that we're lifting women up.
That is great. Thank you, guys. That was really, really terrific. I'd like to do a follow-up question. I think we got a really clear idea of how the three of you work together when it comes to legal issues. And I think, Rebecca, you did a nice way of segueing into what I want to talk about next is, obviously, these clients have a lot of needs and a lot of issues. So what happens with their non-legal issues? How are we handling those? Where are we referring them? Are we helping them? What are we doing?
So that the scholarly answer is it depends, because it is not frivolous and insignificant when someone's need is actually just to talk. And although that sounds like social work, and I can assure you I have no degree in social work, sometimes just problem solving and hearing that they don't have any options legally, but we've talked it out, and here are the steps that would need to happen for them to then have a legal remedy. That is something that we can offer 100% of the time. 100% of the time we can listen and meet the need of reassuring them that when the time comes, we will be here for them. We now also have a social worker on staff. Michelle Nittmeyer is an angel from heaven, and has not only brought the functionality of being able to corral resources for each individual person. It's been absolutely breathtaking what she's been able to accomplish. The security that she brings to the three of us, knowing that we can do more for people that call than just give them our legal advice, is invaluable. And then after that, it's just reaching out to our communities. And what the three of us, and Susan, you with incredible support, we believe really strongly in building bridges. I preach to anyone that will listen that social services should not exist in silos, that there should be hands across every single one of our agencies. And the three of us are singularly dedicated to building those relationships with other agencies so that we can make a direct referral, not just, hey, give this person a call, but rather, can I make this call for you? Or can we get her on the phone right now? Or here's her email address, so that it's more, so that, in the industry, they call it a warm handoff. That's really important to us. But But I think that one of the things that is really, really difficult about what we do is when we have to say no, that we can't help someone. And that's either because we're at capacity, or because it's just not what we do, or there isn't a legal remedy. Noreen, I know that you run into this issue a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. It's like sometimes there isn't anything to do because a lot of it rests on, you know, economic insecurity. And although there might be a remedy, you know, to break your lease, there's no remedy to pay your rent. You know, if you've been financially supported by somebody who pulls the rug out once you seek help, you know, I can't pay the rent for them, unfortunately, and that's just sort of the reality. But I do think that understanding what rights you do have, and also what they can't be helped with, is important and part of the process of trying to problem solve. You know, it's just overwhelming when you've been a victim and are trying to assert your rights for the first time. But everything that you've been relying on somebody for is all up in the air. I mean, it's the idea of trying to relocate, to try to figure out how to get a job. You know, for the women who have children, it's also uprooting their children from whatever school district they're in if they decide to move, and that's a huge thing. I mean, we're all mothers, and I mean, just the thought of having to make that choice of something that's probably detrimental to your child, but hopefully will be the best thing in the long run. It's just an overwhelming decision to have to make. So I really do think that, you know, part of what we do is counsel, right? Counsel people, give them advice, give them options, let them know what's available, and unfortunately, you know, sometimes what's not available.
We think about this all the time, because when we get an order of protection that includes the right to the residence, possession of a residence, which in normal speak is just kicking the abuser out, we have to be very clear what the financial ramifications are going to be of that decision, because we want the survivor to make those decisions for herself. And one of the things that I learned from Leah in the time that I have been here is that I have seen her, and I don't mean to speak for her, but Leah, I have seen you have to say to someone, I would love to do this for you, but I need you to understand that this could increase the likelihood of your being detected by immigration and deported.
Yeah. So for immigration, sometimes I do have to say no, because with the immigration practice, if you are undocumented and your abuser is also undocumented, but you've never called the police, and you've never received any kind of assistance, then there isn't anything that's available for them. So I tell them what to do in case the abuser tries to abuse them again, or in cases where it's, there's something called a U visa. If you've been a victim of a crime and there's specifically listed crimes, then you call the police and you help with the investigation, and the police or the court will certify, you can ultimately get your green card and get some kind of legal status in the United States. And domestic violence and aggravated and felonious assault, stalking, intimidation, rape, murder, sexual assault, those are some of the listed crimes. And sometimes if they come to us with the police reports, if it's not domestic violence, if it's not that specifically or similar in nature crime that and the police don't certify, then our hands are tied and we can't get some kind of legal service for them. And other times, like Rebecca said, if they are, waiting pending green card because they married to a U.S. citizen, or if they are the derivative spousal visa on the principal, and if they leave, then they will no longer be in lawful status, and that puts a whole new level of fear in the clients, and they just won't do it. Or if they've lived their entire lives under the grid, under the radar, and we prepare this application and it's filed, but because of the new policy and procedures with immigration, if their application is denied, then yes, they can be placed in removal proceedings. And what happens there? Are they eligible for any kind of forms of relief if they're placed in removal? And at the clinic, with immigration practice, we've become extremely conservative in what we file, because if there's a 1% chance risk of that client being placed into removal proceedings, we won't file it, because I can't sleep with that kind of risk. So we get a second opinion, a third opinion, because their lives are at stake. Not only is their safety, but their future. And a lot of them, have children here. They've lived here 20, 30 years, and they are, law-abiding, residents. They might not have legal status, but they belong here, and they've been here just as long as I have. And I really can't file an application for them unless it's a very strong case, because of the risks involved. And a lot of the times I'm telling the clients what the risks are and how risk averse are they. And they ask me to make the decision for them, and I can't. I tell them what their options are, what the pros and cons of each option are, and they have to ultimately make that decision. And it's very hard for them to make that decision, but I cannot make it for them. And that it's really difficult. I think all of us, when we tell them these are your options, and they just look at us and ask us over and over again, what would you do? What can I do? Tell me what to do. Only thing we can say back is that you have to just decide and take the time to decide. And we tell them a lot of what to do even if you don't want to file an immigration application, we do let them know how to safety plan to stay safe, like Rebecca, or also safety plan for immigration purposes, starting to gather documents before their abuser can destroy things. And so how to work behind the scenes in case they want to file something in the future.
Great. That's great, guys. Thank you so much. So, I think all of you have touched a little bit about laws that are very helpful to survivors. Can we delve into that a little more deeply? I know, Leah, you started off talking about the U visa. What are some other laws that are particularly helpful to undocumented immigrant survivors?
Sure. So the U visa is huge. The second one is the Violence Against Women's Act. So if you are undocumented or have no legal status in the United States, and you are married to a U.S. citizen or a lawful permanent resident who is an abuser, and you can prove that A, you're in a bona fide marriage, and B, you're a victim of extreme cruelty and or abuse, then you can file an application with immigration without the help or the knowledge of your U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident spouse, and ultimately get your green card in the United States. We're working on several of those applications right now. They take about 2 to 2.5 years, and it's very important. And, when we think of domestic violence, we think about physical abuse, but as we know, it's not just physical abuse. Most of the times there is no physical abuse. It's emotional, mental, psychological, sexual, financial, spiritual. And sometimes in our cases, they've never called the police. But we get as much evidence as possible. And most of our Violence Against Women Act applications are close to 200 pages, because there's affidavits, there is, photos, there's text messages, emails, there's sometimes an order of protection, but there's all these other evidence and affidavits and statements from other social workers, community organization, friends, and families who've witnessed the bona fide marriage or the abuse. And so with that one, you don't need to call the police, and there doesn't have to be physical abuse. With the U visa, you have to contact the police, because you need the police or the judge or a certifying agency to certify the application before we file it with immigration. So those are the two biggest applications that we file with immigration that I can think of at the moment. Rebecca, Noreen?
So VAWA also protects people who live in subsidized housing or public housing as well. So the same act also protects victims of domestic violence who are applying to subsidized or public housing, so that basically they can't be denied application because they've been a victim of domestic violence. And also, I think more importantly for eviction cases it would be a defense for a housing authority or property management to try to evict somebody because they were victims of domestic violence. So basically, usually you could allege a lease violation for criminal activity of anybody who lived in that household. But if that household member was the abuser, then the tenant, the victim, would not be subject to being evicted based on the actions of their abuser. And that actually was a huge thing, because housing authorities were doing that. If your boyfriend was the person who For example, damaged your, was drunk and beat you up and damaged the property and the door was damaged because they kicked it in, you as the tenant could be facing eviction because your door was damaged. That was actually happening. So VAWA really does protect victims of domestic violence in eviction situations. I already mentioned the Illinois Safe Homes Act, and that's an act that protects tenants who are in both private housing and also housing choice voucher participants and subsidized housing as well. And it allows them to break their lease or possibly change their locks.
Rebecca?
My practice also obviously benefits from VAWA, but on a more immediate basis. So there's a lot of things. There's laws in the code that protect women on college campuses, but the laws that we use in the practice most often, there's a Victims of Crime Act and other ways to be compensated, but we every single day we use the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, which is the act that allows us to obtain emergency relief for people in immediate danger, otherwise known as orders of protection. And we use the Illinois Dissolution of Marriage Act, Marriage and Dissolution of Marriage Act. Does not roll off the tongue. And the wonderful thing about that is that we can use that not only for people who are married, but for people who have children in common. And so to be eligible for relief under the Dissolution of Marriage Act, having a child in common is all you need. And there's a lot of safety available. But I want to be clear that choosing to get divorced is so personal. Choosing to leave an abuser in any way is so dangerous that it's not something that we ever take really lightly. It's not something that we say, oh girl, you got to leave that guy, because the possibility of death goes up astronomically after a survivor, a victim of domestic violence decides to leave. So I want to be clear that we use the law that the client is ready to have used on their behalf. I am never opposed to somebody coming in just to get information. Does it break my heart when they leave and they won't let me take action for them? Definitely. But we know that it takes 6 to 8 times for a victim to leave an abuser. And every single time she leaves, she collects resources and information. And I will always be the person to give her that information and to completely support her going back to her abuser if that is what she believes will keep her safe right now. And then when she's ready to leave, and that's a decision that she has made on her own, then I can't wait to use these laws to protect people and to get them legally out of abusive relationships. Because what we know is that the safest you can be is to be legally out of an abusive relationship. And so there is an incredible amount of safety that comes with a parenting plan, a parenting order that designates when an abuser is allowed to see the kids and doesn't just show up at the house, even if they're not living, they haven't been living together. I have a client that I've spoken to recently, and they've been separated for a long time, but he just shows up. There's no order. And he can, and so he says, I want to see the kids. And he just shows up, and she doesn't have a piece of paper that she can say to the police, this is not his time to see the kids. I'll give you another example. People who are separated, and I see this regularly, men who use the kids and take parenting time and don't bring the kids back. And someone will call and say, well, can I call the police? Absolutely you can, but do not be surprised when the police say, I don't have anything to enforce. I don't have a piece of paper that says that he's not allowed to have these kids right now. And so one of the things that is amazing is when someone comes in and they don't know how much the law can help, being able to say to them, I can get you this piece of paper, and this piece of paper, although only as good as you're willing to enforce it, if you are willing to enforce it, It's magic. And that moment is why we do the work, I think. And then we can use either the Illinois Domestic Violence Act to get someone some emergency relief. And I will say, this is a bizarro time. And I could just stop there. But the reason that that's important right now is because someone can call me and I can patch them straight through to the courthouse, excuse me, where a court advocate will help them fill out their petition, file it, and they go in front of the judge on Zoom. And literally in the intake, they get an order of protection. I mean, that makes me feel like a superhero. But that's only because of COVID. And COVID has messed up the world in so many ways, but this is actually pretty phenomenal. And they don't have to be in the same room as their abuser. Now, there are some drawbacks, and I'm happy to get into them if you want me to eventually, Susan, about doing whole hearings. I do whole trials over Zoom, and that is challenging. But in that moment that someone finds out that there is a law that can protect them and that they can do it right now, and that I can just patch them through and they can talk to one of these angels that work as court advocates, fill out a petition online and go in front of the judge. And by that afternoon, they can have a piece of paper that they can enforce with the police. That's why we get up in the morning.
Great, Rebecca. I think we've talked now, and I think you all raised some really good points about how helpful the law is to survivors. But now I'd like to shift gears a little bit. I'd like to talk about how the law sometimes really fails our survivor clients, and examples of that, and maybe what we could even change, if we could. Rebecca, you want to start off?
The law fails all the time, and the debate that goes on in my head is, does the law fail because the law sucks, or does the law fail because the interpretation sucks? And that is an important distinction, because one of those things can get trained away, possibly with education of judges. Here's a really good example that drives me insane. If you look at the Illinois Domestic Violence Act, the judge who hears an order of protection, presides over an order of protection proceeding, has jurisdiction to enter financial relief. So going back to the conversation that we were just having, that when we get an order of protection and we're possibly excluding from the residence the breadwinner, and now, although we have kept our clients safe, we have rendered them completely resourceless. There's a whole section on the draft order that allows for financial remedies. The judges won't do it. And the judges won't do it because they don't think that they have the resources to determine what a reasonable financial remedy would be, in the way that the family court has those resources to look at a financial affidavit and tax returns and pay stubs. And so you have these two courts, the domestic violence court that presides over all domestic violence issues under the Illinois Domestic Violence Act that have not been consolidated with a family law case. And we have the family court, and there's the cavern. There's this aperture between them. And so it's very hard for me to get financial remedies from a domestic violence court. And that is a humongous failure. That's a humongous failure, because we could do it all, and being able to say to a client, not only am I going to be able to get you protected, but I'm going to get an order that's going to require him to continue to pay for everything that he was paying before he got kicked out of your home. That would be phenomenal. But one major way that the law fails is in this bizarre interpretation, is in the function of the law, where I can't get those financial remedies from that court. I have to file either a divorce case or a parentage case and get in front of a family law judge to get some immediate relief. And so I have a lot of ideas about how to fix that. I have ideas about how to change the law so that there is a presumption of income that the court could make, be it 2 times the minimum wage, something that if there were children involved, that there could be a formula, in the same way that we have a formula on the Dissolution of Marriage Act for child support, that we could insert or assert in the domestic violence court that would really help someone who might be without resources. And so that is something that is just one of the things that I would really, really love to change.
Great, thank you, Rebecca. Leah, how about in immigration? What do you see as failing a survivor, and what would you like to see changed?
Everything has to change. But I'll start off with, for the VAWA applications, you have to show bona fide marriage and evidence of abuse. Now, when you have someone who's undocumented, without a social security number, without any kind of documents, who have been with an abuser who uses that to continue to abuse them, it's really difficult to get joint assets, or commingling of funds, that bank accounts, credit cards, that doesn't exist. Cell phone, car insurance, health insurance, that doesn't exist. They might have some photos or some social media, but when the abuser, like one of our cases, when the abuser came in because there was an order of protection and he had to leave the house, he took his wife's cell phone with him because he said it was his property. And so she lost everything, all the photos of the abuse, that the bruises on her body, pictures of their relationship, everything to show the abuse and the bona fide marriage was gone instantly. He changed the password so she couldn't even access it through the cloud. So that happens. And then when you're trying to gather the evidence to file a strong application for a client, if they don't have that, I believe them. I believe their story. But my job is to have immigration believe them. And I know the way immigration thinks. You are guilty until you prove yourself innocent. So you're guilty of immigration fraud. You're guilty of filing fraudulent documents until you prove yourself innocent with all these supplemental documents that are sometimes impossible to get. So that is when I understand why it's there. I understand why there's requirements, but it's also very discretionary. Each officer has so much power to deny an application, to issue a request for evidence, asking for all the documents again. So that's frustrating. Another one is, I'm hoping it's just a training issue, but when we try to get the U visa certifications, there's some police departments and police stations that are amazing to work with because they understand the law. They understand that it's not them approving these applications. It's really ultimately immigration's decision, but they're there to do whatever it takes to help their immigrant community and to also to keep a safe community. But there's some that do not do it, even if it is a qualifying crime, even if all the elements are there, even if, they did help with the investigation. Ultimately, there was even a conviction because they don't want to get involved in immigration matters. So the Voices Act was created in 2018, 2019, I can't remember for sure, that gives some kind of requirements and a policy and a procedure for U visa certifications. But some police stations do it, some don't. And it's very difficult to figure that out. And it's very frustrating. And to go back to your client and to say that we're stuck and we can't get this done crushes me. And we do everything that we can, and we try to get other agencies to help us. And we do a lot of, teamwork in this, but there's only so much that we can do. And so it's just so frustrating, so incredibly frustrating. And, we talk about the clinic all the time. Our form of self-care at the clinic was talking to each other immediately about all of these cases, good or bad, so we can, move on with our day to keep doing what we do. And because we can't do that instantly, it's been really, really tough. And we've been having very difficult U and VAWA cases, a lot of sexual assault, a lot of domestic battery cases. And, I complain all the time that I miss seeing these faces and hearing these faces in real life. I've never met Noreen. Noreen is, she got hired during COVID, so I don't know if she really exists. So it's so sad that we can't talk about this because we learn so much from each other, different ways to help our clients, different forms of evidence we can get if they don't have everything. And I miss that. But I know I have hope that we'll all be together very soon. But if I can have my dream job, which is the master of the universe, there'd be a lot of laws that would be changed instantly. Noreen, if you're really there.
I'm just a figment of your imagination, Leah.
Then we're all living in Leah's head. It's a beautiful place.
I'm not sure it's so much that I wish that certain housing laws would change in regards to domestic violence, but I think the main problem that I see for housing is just the lack of affordable housing, and particularly in the suburbs. That's the problem, and that's the reality, and that's true for everybody, but it's obviously exacerbated for victims of domestic violence who are trying to start over and gain economic stability along with housing stability, and I think that's just really a tough issue. Chicago is just, it's just hard to live here because it's so expensive. And that's just a problem that exists, not necessarily with domestic violence, but just across the board. If I had my way, I'd love to see more transitional housing for survivors of domestic violence. It's always so difficult. The shelters are always overloaded, but also just, for families, women with children who need to have some type of intermediary transitional housing to get them back up on their feet. I'd love to see that be funded more. And I guess for me, I also I really hate the crime-free ordinances, the nuisance ordinances that exist now. And these are basically the ordinances where if there's too many calls, too many police calls to a certain apartment building, the landlords get penalized basically. And so that just drives me crazy, because then the landlords are always, they're gonna try to get rid of tenants where there are a lot of phone calls to that, 911 calls to that particular unit. And this obviously impacts victims of domestic violence. Yeah, they're going to be calling the police a lot, and they should be, because there's a real threat. And even if they aren't able to, at that time, after that first 911 call, leave their abuser and figure it all out and get help, it shouldn't prevent them from being able to make that second or third or fourth call. And so anyway, that's one of my pet peeves. So I think that these ordinances were sort of created to prevent crime, but instead what happens is people who are victims of crime can't use what should be available to them, which is the police, as their safety net.
I also just want to add that one of the huge obstacles that we have, all three of us, is educating people on what the law is. It's really hard for us to get the information out there, and people stay in the shadows for a long time because of misinformation. And that's particularly true, for domestic violence survivors, because their access to information is controlled by their abuser. One of the things that we're working on now is I always, I'm envious of Noreen and Leah, because they can hold Know Your Rights presentations. Leah has educated, half of the immigrant community on this side of the border, that about what their rights are, and it's incredible. And she has built these incredibly fruitful relationships around our service territory, and built networks of people that can educate and talk about immigration laws. No one's showing up to Know Your Rights presentation for DV. That's just not a thing. And so there's just so much misinformation. I would say the number one, and who knows what these statistics are, but I would say the number one misinformation, if I can use it singularly, is the threat that someone can take your kids away. It's insanely powerful. And one of the things that Noreen was talking about earlier is we're all moms. And when someone walks in and says, it took me 3 years to get here because he said he was going to take my kids away, I would do anything to protect my children. And so that is insanely powerful, either because they threatened to have the mom deported, or because they say I'm going to cut, you know, that they're not going to have food, they're not going to have, or I'm going to be able to prove to the court because I'm employed and you're not employed, and that I'm going to be able to keep the kids. And that is just primal. It is all of the abuse all across the spectrum. It is financial, it is spiritual, it is physical, because to think that you don't have a visceral reaction to that kind of threat. So we are constantly searching for ways to get information out there, even just to let people know what a domestically violent relationship looks like. People come to us all the time and say, I didn't even know I was in an abusive relationship. And one of the things that we're doing, if I could just plug this really quickly, is the bananabreadhelp.com. You know, the three of us partnered with the Vernon Hills Public Library, and we put together a series of videos that are very, very short, that can be listened to, you know, with captions, and that can be turned off, but they're embedded in a banana bread recipe, so that if you walk by, if an abuser walks by, it does not look like an information website, except if the information is, you know, how to bake better banana bread. And this is a way for people to get information. We did a series of videos about how to even identify if you're in an abusive relationship, and what to think about to get out of an abusive relationship, and what your rights are. And this is really the way that we're focusing on right now, to get information out there in a know your rights kind of environment, so that people even know that they are not stuck, or they're not stuck forever. And that to me is it's not a failure of the law per se. It's a failure of access to information about the law, so that people can, women in particular and women of color, can know that there's a path, and that we're here. And I say this all the time, but the thing that keeps me up at night, and we're all up at night, is not the people who come to us. Those stories hurt. Those stories are painful for all of us. I had a client once that called to talk about some allegations of abuse against her 6-month-old child. I have 4 child rape cases right now. I was on the phone with this woman. She needed to call me back in 5 minutes, and I lost it. And but for Leah Kim, who knows, because of how painful it was to hear about these allegations. There is a path forward, and those women who have called us, they see it. They see that, and I'm already here for them, and they know that I'm here. It's the women that don't know that I'm here that keep me up at night. It's the people that don't have access to us that keep me up at night. And so the biggest failure that I can cite is failure of access to information.
Thank you, Rebecca. Shifting gears here, as we all know, given that we're on this Zoom call, we are in the age of COVID, and COVID has absolutely had a dramatic impact on all of us, and certainly on the clinic. But I want to specifically focus on how COVID is impacting survivor clients, and survivor clients that each of you have seen. So if we can, Rebecca's already shaking her head and nodding her head, so I'm gonna go with her first.
I mean, what we know is that incidences of skyrocket during lockdown orders, and that access to services to remedy that violence shrinks proportionally. And despite that, the numbers at our clinic are up 44% during COVID. And what that says to me is that the desperation is so high that it's worth risking. Because even though that access, I take calls in the middle of the night, I take calls all weekend long, and when an abuser is asleep, when an abuser's working 3rd shift, whatever it is, we've had to adapt. But the lockdown and the economic insecurity, the access to medical care, the concern of children going to school, we lament this in healthy relationships. This is a burden. This is real. This is scary to our kids. And that is only like over a megaphone if you are locked down with your abuser. Leah, I know that it's particularly terrifying for your clients.
Yeah. COVID has had a disproportionate effect on the undocumented community because so many of them were, on the front lines. They had to work. Most of the Spanish-speaking population in Lake County and in parts of Cook County were, getting their infection rates were sky high. And so at the beginning of COVID, we thought, okay, layoffs are going to come. Immigration filing fees are still there. Fee waivers are next to impossible to get. We thought we would see a decline because if you are just surviving and try to struggle to pay the rent, keep food on the table and a roof over your head, then you're not going to think about immigration. But we have seen a huge uptick on, DV-related immigration cases. And those with mixed status because of, things that they could not, like the CARES Act. If you had an ITIN number, or if you're a mixed status family, you couldn't get the stimulus. So we saw a huge uptick on people trying to legalize their status and try to get any kind of help related to DV. And they just couldn't take it any longer because now that, their spouses were no longer at the office, they didn't have the 8 hours a day to themselves to try to put themselves together to try to deal with their spouse at night or on the weekends. But because they were locked down with their spouse, the abuse and the pressures of, losing their job, losing their immigration status, it exploded. And so people, all of a sudden we got a huge uptick of cases from a specific shelter dealing with in the East, in the South Asian community, because so many of them were on the dependent spouses and their spouses were losing their jobs or just at home all the time and they just couldn't take it. So they had to leave and they actually went to a shelter after years of abuse. COVID was enough for them to push them out with their children, without their children, to a shelter to get away. And so that we've been so busy because of that for immigration and for DV. Noreen?
Well, obviously for housing, it's crazy, right? There's nothing else to say. It's just crazy. People have been economically impacted, obviously, and they can't pay the rent. I think that's just about that just about sums it up. It's just people who have never been in this situation before, who have never had an issue with making rent payments, something that probably was inconceivable to them, is now the reality. There's just a lot of people who are unable at this time to pay their rent. And it definitely has impacted our undocumented population for sure, disproportionately more. Right now, there's still a moratorium on evictions in Illinois, so that's a good thing. But we know that at some point, the moratorium is going to lift, and it's just going to be crazy.
Okay, and we've got about a few minutes left, and I want to end it on a positive note. So what I'd love to do is I'd love to have each of you talk about a win that you've had with a survivor client. And, did you think something was present in that case that made it a win, for example? So if you can, Noreen, I see you first, so I'm going to actually go to you first and ask if you can give me an example of a win for a survivor client.
Sure. I think I was talking a little bit about her, but she actually just emailed me and she just wanted to, she's continuing to have some problems with her landlord, which we are continuing to help her with. But she just wanted to also express how grateful she was for somebody to help her with this, because she didn't realize that the help was possible. And also talking with Rebecca and understanding her rights as a domestic violence victim, I think was really meaningful to her. And she was so appreciative that we were able to help her sort of. And I think, again, part of what we're talking about is the intersection of our practice groups. And, to me, it always feels good and really rewarding too, when we're able to provide this kind of holistic approach and to really help somebody out who didn't even realize that, for example, she had a right to get an order of protection, that she was given this information, and we were able to help her in both areas of the law that she didn't even know she had a problem with.
Thanks. Leah, how about you? Describe a win. And
Sure.
what went
So
in there that made it such a great win?
I think for me, anytime someone who's undocumented calls the clinic just to know what their rights are, what their options are, is a win. For them to take the huge step to call someone they don't know personally, to get any kind, to talk about something and be so vulnerable and be so raw is a win, and I'll take that. But I think the most recent one I had, and this is a total team effort, it's DV housing and immigration. And it's one of our clients, and we actually have like a chat room for this one client because we're helping, the client with the OP, with the divorce, and with immigration. But then, when the abuser left, they were left with thousands of dollars in back rent, electricity, gas. And I think her electricity was shut off. And we just didn't know what to do. And Michelle, our social worker, was doing everything in her power. And thank God for her, because I couldn't have done this. I wouldn't even know where to start. But she called the right people, did everything she could, got the appointments, but we needed something immediately. And I was just talking about this in passing, and Noreen's like, wait a minute, there's something for them. If they're a victim of DV, then yeah, we can switch their name and they can get this on like immediately. And I'm like, what now? And she was explaining it to me. I'm like, okay, don't explain it to me because it's going to get lost in translation. You need to talk to Michelle right now. And they talked, and Michelle was like, Noreen is a godsend, and it was done. And it took a couple of days because there was some kind of confusion, but it was done. And that was huge because, our client has 3 kids, and without electricity, and when everyone's at home, I could not imagine her dealing with that, on top of everything else, with her abuser still texting her and threatening her, with her immigration status, everything. And so that was a huge, huge win that I had nothing to do with. All I said was in passing in one of our other Zoom meetings we're having, and Noreen's like, wait a minute, and that was it. And so that was definitely a team effort, and it made me so happy. And I know it made even Michelle even happier, because even though she did all the hard work. And so Michelle, getting a social worker was on her short list forever. And so to have the social worker is also a huge win. And that was due to COVID. So COVID has helped us. We have Noreen because of COVID. We have Michelle because of COVID. So, thank you, COVID gods, for that, because we so needed them. Right, Rebecca? Gosh, so, and we've been hiring, and it's been such a blessing at the clinic because, Susan, you've done an amazing job as the executive director, handling all the finances and making sure, because we constantly like spoiled children, want, and she rarely says no, and she gives us, and the social worker and Noreen were the biggest gifts. So thank you, so those are my wins.
I want to add Alana.
Yes. Oh my God.
A list of wins.
Yes.
My newest staff attorney.
Yes.
I want to say 2 things. The first is, there is a win every single time I get to tell a client that we're free. There is nothing like going through what is available to a client, having a client say, wow, that really sounds amazing. Okay, what is this cost? And the moment that I can say we are completely pro bono legal aid clinic, it is the happy ending before we even file an appearance. And that is a win every single time. And I am so grateful for being able to say that. And then the wins that we get, there are, I have kept a lot of children safe. I have kept a lot of women safe. I have protected a lot of fathers from really scary, drug abusers. I have a client now who's fighting so hard for his daughter, and I talked to the DCFS worker, and she's going to testify. And she said not only is she going to testify, but she said, here are the things I want you to ask me, which was, a huge hallelujah. But it's even the littler things. And when I say little, I just mean it just takes, maybe 1 court hearing instead of 17, where you have a client and they tell you about the years of abuse, and they're finally ready to do something about it. And you say, okay, would you please send me, whatever you have? And most of the time you go to these hearings without anything more than your client's testimony and its credibility alone. And that can be very challenging over Zoom. Really, really challenging to not have that in-person, emoting from the witness stand. But I have a client who sent me 2,000 text messages. The sustained abuse over these years of every day trying to work with this person to keep him in the kids' lives, and him just cycling every day through, you are evil, but I love you, but you're the worst thing that ever happened to our children, just every single day. And she is doing e-learning with her kids at home. Her kids are phenomenal. And today we went to court and I said, Judge, we need to meet in pre-trial, which is outside of the public realm, and we get into chambers over Zoom. And I said, here's what's going to happen. I have 2,000 emails to introduce into evidence today. And these are going to be in the record, and these children someday are going to be able to look up this case, and they're going to see 2,000 emails that their dad wrote, and I would like not to do that. So here's what I want. And I walked out of that pretrial with every single thing on the list that my client wanted. One hearing. And I got to go back to her and say, we did it. And the answer is yes. And you have everything you want, and it starts now. And you have sustained this every single day, and it's over. And that's magic to me.
And I have to say that as an executive director, hearing these stories just brings great joy to me. So you guys, thank you so much. And thank you everyone who joined us tonight for the panel. This has been really terrific, and I hope very informative for you. And thanks so much.
Thank you. Good night.
All right, thanks everyone. Bye.